In my speech today, or my talk today, I'm going to talk about translation and culture. How Susan Bassnett and Lefevere, actually mostly Lefevere that I will be talking about, how he has focused, André Lefevere, in the 90s on culture, as opposed to just only looking at the text from a linguistic point of view, from the perspective of linguistics. Now, Susan Bassnett and Lefevere have written a book in the 90s, 1990, called Translation History and Culture, in which they dismiss linguistic theories of translation, and they say that they are to move from word to text as a unit, because as you know, that when you are translating, you're translating looking at units of translation, what's called unit of translation. And unit of translation means that you are translating either a word or a phrase or a sentence at that level, or even at the level of a paragraph or a text, a page like a page, or even further, more like a book and a volume. But what they are saying was that you have to move away from these linguistic theories, which they are focusing on word to text as a unit. They want to look beyond that, and that's what they are trying to do. And they are also dismissing the fact of comparing the originals with translations themselves, and which they don't consider, because these comparisons, they don't consider the text in its cultural environment. In other words, you look at the text, but you don't look at the culture part of the text or the environment in which that text is being produced. So they have really focused, Lefevere and Bassnett, instead on the interaction between translation and culture, on the way in which culture has an impact on translation and on the issues of context and history, and on the issues of convention. Of course, this is, with regards to culture and translation, we should not forget Mary Snell Hornby in the 90s, when she wrote about translation as text and politics, moving from translation as text to translation as culture and politics, when she says in her paper, in the same collection that's done by Suzanne and Lefevere, in which that she uses the term the cultural turn, and that was taken up as by both Bassnett and Lefevere, and they are looking at them more closely, looking at this term more closely in their work, in their analysis of the translation. Now, of course, these studies, they are changing the standards in translation over time. The power that exercised in and on the publishing industry in pursuit of certain ideologies, feminist writing and translation as appropriation, translation as colonization, translation as rewriting, as we heard about rewrites. Always we hear Lefevere talks about rewrites, especially when he's talking about Al-Qasidah in Arabic, and how Al-Qasidah has been over years, it has been not well translated by various English translators, in his book that was published in the 90s. And these rewrites, translation as rewriting or rewrites, include also film rewrites. So that's what Lefevere is actually talking about. There is a kind of concentration more, when you're talking about culture and translation, into what the ideology as well it's being influenced by. But this is a very, very important aspect of that. I mean, in the case of translation as rewriting, Andrew Lefevere, as we know, he worked in comparative literature, like the same as Venuti, Lawrence Venuti, who has written a book recently on counter-instrumentalism in translation, and which is quite interesting because he's also talking about how to approach translation, not as an instrumentalist, but as a counter-instrumentalist, i.e. as a hermeneutic, from the hermeneutic approach. However, we're just going back to Lefevere, because that's my main concern in this talk today. In his work in translation studies, he developed his idea from the polysystem theory and from the manipulation school. And his later work on translation and culture, which represents like a bridging point to the cultural turn of Mary Snell Hornby idea of translation. So that's really what are the main focus of Lefevere. He's talking about rewriting literature, and he's talking about also ideology and poetics, poetiology as he calls it, the poetics. And that's when he talked about in his book about the poetics of when in the case of missing Qasidah, al-Qasidah. Fitzgerald considered Persians inferior in his Omar al-Khayyam, and he felt that he should really take liberties in the translation in order to improve on the original. He made it to conform, or made it conform to the expected Western literary conventions of his time, and the work was a phenomenal commercial success. Now, it was a success because of conforming to the expected conventions in the literary milieu in the West, and that's why it was very successful. Omar al-Khayyam's, Fitzgerald's translation of Omar al-Khayyam, because he was not doing the Rubaiyat al-Khayyam, he was not translating it, he was rewriting it in the form that will be accepted in the conventions in the Western literary milieu, and that's why it has been a very has a great success. Now, if we compare that with a translation, of course, the same goes to the Arabian Nights as well. When it was translated, also there was promoting that exotic aspect in it. In the Western eyes, and that's why it was actually also successful and very, very popular in the Western milieu, literary milieu, in the translation studies as well. But it has been translated so many times, this Arabian Nights. It was called, Arabian Nights is a very domesticated way of translating 1001 Nights. And I'm talking about domestication here, which is Venuti's approach, and Schleimacher's in 1813, where Schleimacher says you are taking the author to the reader here in this case, or the reader to the author, domestication and foreignizing here. Now, going back to the element of the Qasidah and how it was mistranslated sometimes, that was really an interesting chapter by Lefevere about it, and it's not that popular. I have noticed when he talked about the rewriting of Qasidah according to the Western conventions when you are translating it, and that's why it was sort of half popular, but because there are some concepts in the Qasidah, and he was talking about Labid ibn Rabi'a's Qasidah in particular, and he was saying that some of these images were not presented well because the concepts are not clearly explained by the English translators of Al-Qasidah, and that was really the issue that he's raised really quite intelligently and intelligibly as well, which I really like, even though that chapter is really not that popular nowadays, and I didn't see any discussions going on about his chapter when he was talking about poetics and how these poetics are rewritten for the Western literary publishers so that they can publish it, and that was the case why it was getting published in that way. Otherwise, it was just domesticated in many ways. And when I say domesticated, I meant that it is influenced by the translating culture. The translating culture, which is into English, it has influenced the way you translate that piece or the Qasidah, for example, which means it's a long poem in English, or it's of an epic form, or it's a longish kind of form of poetry. So these are the poetics. So it has to be, when you are translating poetry, he's saying, it has to fit in with the conventions in the English conventions.